Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you've all had a great week. If you are new here, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. So today we're going to talk about the Shell Lake Massacre. The Shell Lake Massacre happened in 1967 in Saskatchewan, Canada. The Peterson family consisted of Jim and Evelyn and their 9 kids. And on August 15th, 1967, a man from a nearby town walked into the Petersons' house and nearly wiped out the entire family. And this absolutely terrified the community. People were living in constant fear that there was a crazed killer on the loose and that they could be next. But thankfully, it wouldn't take the police long to figure out who was responsible. Before we get into today's case, I'd like to tell you all about today's sponsor, Dime Beauty. Dime Beauty is a skincare and beauty company that focuses on creating clean, affordable, and effective skincare products. Once I turned 30, I really started to care more about my skin, especially my face, and not even just from an anti-aging standpoint, but also just from an overall skin health standpoint. I care a lot more about the types of products that I put on my skin now. I need it to be effective without being irritating, and I also need it to be affordable. And Dime Beauty really does check off a lot of boxes for me when it comes to skincare. I've been using the Work System and the TBT system. The Work System includes the Gentle Jelly Cleanser, the Super Skin Toner, Hyper Glow, Hyaluronic Acid Serum, the Dewy Day Cream, and the Restorative Night Cream. And the TBT system includes the TBT Serum and the TBT Cream. And it works on like fine lines and wrinkles and dark spots. My skin isn't super sensitive, but occasionally I'll test out a new product and it'll leave my skin a little bit irritated. And that hasn't happened with any of the products that I've tried from Dime Beauty so far. I've really just started out with Dime Beauty skincare, but what I can say so far is that my skin is really soft, it looks smoother, and most importantly to me, it looks more hydrated. All of the Dime products are clean and sustainable, and they're also vegan and cruelty free. There are no sulfates, phthalates, BPAs, or BPSs. I also really like that Dime lists all of their ingredients on their website. They're actually really proud of the formulas that they've come up with, and they promote full transparency when it comes to the ingredients in their products. So you get all of the benefits of effective, affordable skincare without having to worry that there are any weird unknowns in the products. Dime also offers 60-day returns and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. And you can go to dimebeautyco.com/summer and enter promo summer at checkout to get 20% off your own Dime skincare routine. Thanks again to Dime Beauty for sponsoring this video, and now let's jump into the case. Early in the morning on August 15th, 1967, in a small town right outside of Shell Lake in Saskatchewan, a man named Wildrew Lang arrived at the home of his friend, 47-year-old Jim Peterson. And as soon as Wildrew arrived, he knew that something was off. Jim and his wife, 42-year-old Evelyn, had 9 children, and they would usually be up playing in the yard and doing chores outside. Jim would usually be working outside as well. Evelyn would be up taking care of their 1-year-old son Larry or milking the cows. This house was always lively. But this morning, it was eerily quiet. There was no movement, no noise, nothing. So Wildrew got out of his truck and he walked up to the Petersons' front door. He slowly opened the door, and as soon as he stepped inside, he saw the body of his friend Jim Peterson lying in the entryway of the house in a pool of blood. Wildrew was in total shock, and he knew that whoever had done this could still be in the house. So he decided not to walk any further inside. So instead, he ran out of the house and he jumped into the Peterson station wagon and he drove until he found the nearest payphone. He called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and told them everything that he had just seen. He told them that his friend Jim Peterson was dead in the front entryway of his house and that it looked like he had been murdered. After he reported this to the police, he got back in the car and he drove to the Seminar family home. Alvin and Marjorie Seminar and their kids were neighbors to the Petersons. They actually lived right across the street from them, and the two families were pretty close. And as soon as the Seminar family saw Wildrew pull up, they knew that something was wrong because he was driving Jim's car. Wildrew was completely frantic, and he just started begging Alvin Seminar to get in the car and come back over to the Petersons with him. You know, he said, "Something's wrong with Jim. I'm pretty sure he's dead, and I need someone to go back over to the house with me to wait for the police." So Alvin Seminar gets into the car and they drive across the road back to the Petersons' house, and they waited outside for the police to arrive. The police finally arrived and they walked into the house and they immediately spotted Jim's dead body. He had obviously been shot several times, and so they knew from the beginning that they were dealing with a homicide. And as they continued to search the house, they found 6 more dead bodies. The Peterson house had 2 bedrooms. One bedroom is where Jim and Evelyn and their 1-year-old son Larry slept, and the second bedroom is where most of the kids slept. There were 2 beds in this room. 3 kids would sleep in one bed, 3 kids would sleep in the other bed, and then the rest of the kids would sleep on a fold-out cot in the living room. Police found 11-year-old Dorothy dead on the fold-out cot. 3-year-old Colin, 5-year-old William, and 13-year-old Mary were found dead in one of the beds in the bedroom, and 17-year-old Jean and 9-year-old Pearl were found dead in the other bed. And nestled between Jean and Pearl was the lone survivor. 4-year-old Phyllis was found lying face down on the bed, squeezed between her sister's dead bodies. The officer scooped Phyllis up and brought her out to Alvin's seminar in Wildrow Lane while he continued to search for more victims. Now, at first, there was like a fleeting thought that Evelyn could have something to do with this because they couldn't find her anywhere, or 1-year-old Larry. They searched all over the house and they couldn't find them. So they thought, maybe something was going on in the marriage. Maybe Evelyn just snapped and she killed her family and she fled and she took the baby with her. It didn't seem likely at all to the people who knew the Petersons. Evelyn was really kind, she was mild-mannered, and she really loved her family, so it just didn't make sense for her to do something like this. And that idea was quickly thrown out when the police finally walked outside behind the house. They found the bodies of Evelyn and Larry in the backyard, and Evelyn was still holding Larry in her arms when they were discovered. So this was now almost an entire family wiped out. 4-year-old Phyllis was the only survivor in the house. Jim and Evelyn did have one more daughter, 19-year-old Kathy, but she had recently gotten married and she and her husband moved to another area of Canada. So word does get back to Kathy the next day that her family had been murdered back at home at Shell Lake, and she was also told that one of her siblings had survived, but she didn't know which one it was. She actually didn't find out until she made it back to Shell Lake. So the police didn't really know where to start with this investigation. No one knew anyone who would want to hurt the Peterson family. They had no enemies. They were all really well liked in the area. Shell Lake is a tiny little village. The population today is less than 200 people. So this is an everyone knows everyone situation. And Jim and Evelyn had both grown up in the area, so they were very well known and they were very well liked. They got married in 1946 and they had a happy marriage. There was no sign of any issues in their relationship. They had 9 kids ranging in age from 19 to only 1 year old. So the order of the kids is Kathy first, then Jean, then Mary, Dorothy, Pearl. Then they finally had their first son, William, then Phyllis, Colin, and Larry. And the house that the family had been living in was actually Jim's childhood home. Jim and Evelyn and the kids had moved into that house after Jim's parents moved out. They had lived in a larger house, like just right up the street, but it was really poorly insulated, so the winters were brutal. And so when Jim's parents moved, the family decided to move into their old house. It was much smaller, but it had a furnace in the basement, so that alone made the move worth it. Jim was described as a very hard worker. He spent hours every day taking care of the farm, keeping it up and running. He loved his kids. He loved his wife. Evelyn was said to be very sweet and easygoing. Those close to her can't remember a time where she ever even raised her voice at her children. By all accounts, Evelyn and Jim were great parents and they had a really good, solid relationship. The kids were always outside playing together. They would help out on the farm. The oldest daughter, Kathy, remembers having a really good childhood. In July of that year, 1967, just 1 month before the murders, Kathy had gotten married to a man named Lee Hill. Her sister Jean was a bridesmaid, and Jim and Evelyn did everything they could to make sure that Kathy and Lee had the perfect day. Lee had just recently gotten a job offer right before they got married in Sherwin, British Columbia, and he and Kathy had decided to go ahead and take that job and make the move to British Columbia just 2 days after their wedding. So I'm not super familiar with Canadian geography, but based on what Google Maps told me, Chetwynd, where Kathy and Lee were moving, was like a 12-hour drive from Shell Lake. So this was a huge move. And so the day that Kathy left, it was a very emotional day for the family. The Petersons didn't have a phone in their home, and with Kathy moving so far away, everyone was just really emotional. They didn't know when they were going to see her again or even speak to her again. So it was definitely a bittersweet day for the family. And right before Kathy left, her sister Jean told her that she had this feeling that she would never see Kathy again. But Kathy reassured Jean that they would see each other again soon, and then she and Lee left to settle into their new lives. But little did Kathy know, Jean was right. They would never see each other again, because just 1 month after this conversation, nearly the entire Peterson family would be wiped out by a deeply disturbed man named Victor Hoffman. So Victor Hoffman was born on January 15th, 1946. His parents were Stella and Robert Hoffman, and he was the fifth of 7 children. He grew up on a farm in Leask, Saskatchewan, and from a very young age, Stella and Robert knew that something was not right with Victor. At first, he seemed to be developing normally. He was hitting all of the same milestones around the same time as his siblings, but Stella and Robert started to see a change in Victor's demeanor once he hit his toddler years. He would get upset very easily. He was aggressive. He would become violent. He would bang his head against the walls and the floors when he got mad. He would throw these just really, really wild tantrums where he just was completely inconsolable. He also started obsessively pulling out his own hair, and he did this so often that he ended up creating a bald spot on his head. And as he grew up and started school, he was pretty much always alone. He was very, very shy, like so shy that he just never talked to anyone. So no one ever really got to know Victor. He didn't really seem to care about not having friends. He seemed to be fine on his own, but his parents were worried about him. You know, they could see that their son was struggling. And by the age of only 6 years old, Victor started having some very disturbing psychological issues. He started having these really vivid hallucinations, and these hallucinations always involved a demon-like creature that he believed to be the devil. Victor described this creature as being tall and dark with a long tail and no genitals. And this creature appeared to Victor all the time. This was a constant occurrence. And this was something that Victor dealt with consistently starting at the age of 6 and throughout the rest of his life. He would also see angels, and as time went on, he started to believe that he was hearing the voice of God and that God was speaking directly to him. His parents said that when he was a child, they would tell him, to go outside and do chores, and when they would go out to check on him, they would find him sitting in the middle of the field, just completely blank, just staring off into space, totally oblivious to what was happening around him. And by the age of 10, Victor started having this uncontrollable urge to kill. And he really wanted to kill a person, but he managed to suppress those urges for now. Instead, he would satiate these urges by killing animals. He would just go around the farm and kill all kinds of animals, including dogs, cats, squirrels, just whatever he could easily get his hands on. So one day in May of 1967, so Victor's like 21 years old at this point, he, his father, and one of his brothers were in a field near their house. Victor was sitting in the driver's seat of the family's farm truck, and his dad and his brother were standing nearby in the grass. And out of nowhere, Victor just started cracking up laughing at nothing, at least nothing that Robert and his other son could see. So Robert asked Victor, what's so fun? Like, what are you laughing at? And without a word, Victor put the truck in drive and took off, and he started heading in the direction of his brother. Luckily, his brother did manage to jump out of the way before Victor could hit him with the truck, but this was really upsetting, and Robert couldn't understand why Victor had just done this. It just was so random. And just a few weeks after that incident, Victor would finally have his first mental breakdown that would land him in a psychiatric hospital. So on May 28th, Victor's mom, Stella, was standing in the kitchen near the window, and she suddenly started hearing gunshots, and it was coming from outside. So she goes over to the kitchen window and she looks out, and she sees her son Victor shooting up towards the sky, and she couldn't see what he was shooting at. So Stella ran outside and she's like, "Victor, what are you doing? What are you shooting at?" And he just turns to her and says, "Mom, I just shot the devil." Now, by this point, the family knew that Victor was teetering on the edge as far as his mental health goes, and Stella was really worried when she saw Victor with a gun. She knew he was unstable. So she tells Victor that he needs to drop the gun, which he did refuse to do at first. He even shot up in the sky a few more times, but he did eventually drop the gun, and then he ran to his car and he drove off. And Stella, she was really upset about what just happened, but the most alarming part was what Victor had said, that he had just shot the devil. Like, what did that even mean? Stella and Robert at this point didn't know that Victor was having these visions, these hallucinations. So she had no clue what he meant by shooting the devil. So Victor took off in his car, and Stella went straight to Robert to tell him what had just happened. And they made the decision that they needed to hide every gun they owned so that Victor couldn't get to them. Then just about 30 minutes after Victor had left the house, he pulled back up at his parents' house, and he walked into the house and he told his parents that he wanted them to call a pastor. Victor had been resisting the urge to kill a person since he was 10 years old, and he's now 21. And the urges are just getting stronger and stronger, and His mental health is just quickly deteriorating, and he knows this. So he knew that if he didn't talk to someone and tell them exactly what he's been experiencing for years, that he was going to snap and he was finally going to kill someone. So Stella and Robert immediately call a local pastor to come over and talk to Victor. And after speaking to Victor alone for a while, the pastor came out of the room and told Stella and Robert that Victor was deeply disturbed and that he needed immediate help. He advised them to take Victor to a hospital like right now, and they did. They ended up taking Victor to Saskatchewan Hospital in the city of North Battleford, and this was about an hour and a half away from where Victor and his family lived in Leask. And after being evaluated by doctors, Victor finally had a diagnosis. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, this is all happening back in the 60s, so there still weren't many super effective treatment options for people who were suffering from schizophrenia. So Victor's doctors used a combination of electroconvulsive therapy and tranquilizing drugs to pretty much keep him calm and mostly just out of it. Victor also took part in regular therapy sessions, and during these sessions, Victor would tell the doctors that he saw demons. He saw demons and angels. He spoke to God. And Victor really thought that he was seeing these things. He thought that they were actually there. He did not believe that he was hallucinating. He also told them that he believed that he had a second brain in his body that was put there by the devil. And anytime that Victor would mention any of this to the doctors, they would just tell him, this isn't real. Your brain is just tricking you into seeing these things. They're not actually there. None of this stuff is really happening. But Victor would always argue with the doctors, and he would say, no, this is really happening to me. And he would tell them that he's actually physically fought the devil before. He's actually put his hands on him and touched him. And he'd say that he had long conversations with the devil, and he's talked to angels. He's spoken to God. Like, he really believed that this was happening. Victor was described by the staff at the hospital as withdrawn and indifferent. It just sounds like he seemed blank, like he was just completely detached from everything that was going on around him. So after a while, Victor started to realize that if he ever wanted to be released from the hospital, he needed to convince the doctors that the treatment was working. He needed to convince them that he was no longer seeing demons. He was no longer speaking to God or seeing angels. He needed to convince them that all of their efforts were actually working and he was making progress. So that's exactly what he did. When Victor had initially been admitted to the hospital, the doctors told his parents that they expected that he would be there for at least a year before he was ready to be released back out into society. Their initial evaluation of Victor revealed that his mental state was very, very fragile, and it would take him a long time to be stable enough to go back out into the world. But just 2 months after being admitted, Victor was released from the hospital. He was released into his parents' custody, and the only thing that he was given before he left was a prescription for the tranquilizing drugs that he'd been given at the hospital. So Stella and Robert had done pretty much everything right in this situation. They had tried to get their son the help that he needed. And when they were initially told that he was going to be in the hospital for a year, they were really sad about it. They felt horrible for leaving him in that place for a whole year. So when they got word that he was being released after only 2 months, they were really hopeful. They thought, well, he must be responding really well to the treatment, and so he's on his way to a healthy mental state. But of course, we know that that's not what was going on at all. Victor was actually just getting worse and worse every day. And once he was back at home with his parents, he did try to keep himself busy. He would do chores on the farm. He would work on engines and stuff. He was really trying to distract himself, but the distractions weren't working. He also stopped taking the drugs that the hospital had given him. So now he was fully back to square one, and he was just getting worse and worse by the day. At first, Victor was pretty good at hiding his mental struggles from his parents, but eventually Stella and Robert started to pick up on the warning signs. They started to see that he was getting a little more aggressive. He was more confrontational. Things were starting to slip right back to the way they were before. He was lashing out. He was being aggressive. He was making threats. And Stella and Robert confronted Victor about this. They told him, maybe you need to go back to the hospital. But Victor begged his parents not to take him back. He said that he would rather die than go back to that place. And so they didn't take him back. But if they would have known what Victor was secretly plotting, they probably would have done things differently. Just a couple of weeks after being released from the hospital, Victor was having murderous thoughts pretty much every second of every day. It was literally all he could think about. It was taking over his mind completely. He knew that he was gearing up to finally kill a person, but he needed to decide who. At first, he considered killing his own family. He thought about killing his parents and all of his brothers and sisters, but he decided against that for some reason. So he started thinking that he should kill a total stranger. And this is where the Petersons come into Victor's story. Victor had never met the Petersons. They were total strangers to him, but their paths were about to cross in the worst way imaginable. At around 3 a.m. on the morning of August 15th, 1967, the need to kill finally got to be too much for Victor to handle, and he finally decided to act on the urges he'd been trying to suppress since he was 10 years old. He quietly crept out of the house so that he wouldn't wake his parents or his siblings, and he went out to the garage. He tried to occupy his mind by messing with the car engine, but that wasn't working. One of the family dogs was in the garage with him, and for a moment he thought about killing the dog, to satisfy this urge. But in the end, he decided to fuel up his car, grab his .22 caliber rifle, and drive around until he found an opportunity to kill a person. I'm not really sure why he had access to this rifle. His parents had hidden all of the weapons, but I'm assuming that once he came home from the hospital, his parents had initially thought that he was rehabilitated, so maybe they gave him his rifle back. I'm not really sure about that, but whatever the case, he put his .22 caliber rifle in the car with him, and he just started driving around until he found someone to kill. So he just drove around for a while. He went to random little towns here and there until he eventually found himself in the village of Shell Lake, and he spotted the Peterson home. The Petersons had a really long driveway, and there were actually 2 gates that you had to get through to drive directly up to the house. So Victor made his way down the driveway, and he stopped at both gates and opened them up so he could continue up to the house. When he finally made it to the front of the house, he parked his car, he grabbed his rifle, and he made his way to the front door, and the door was unlocked. So he walked in. Now, Victor had drove around for so long that at this point the sun was starting to come up, which meant that Jim and Evelyn were already awake for the day. Jim was in his and Evelyn's bedroom, sitting at the end of the bed, getting dressed to start his day, to do his chores around the farm, when he heard someone open the front door. So Jim yells, "Who's there?" But there's no answer. So he continued to yell out, "Who's there?" But still there's no answer. At first, he probably wasn't alarmed when he heard the door open. He was expecting his friend Wildrew Lang that morning. He was coming over to help Jim with some work. But when he yelled out and he didn't get an answer, he started to get a little creeped out. So Jim got up and he started to walk towards the front of the house to see who had walked in. And that's when Victor Hoffman emerged with his rifle pointed right at Jim, and he started firing, and he hit Jim several times. But even after being shot, Jim still desperately tried to fight Victor off. He kept walking towards Victor, trying to push him out of the house. And the entire time that this is going on, Victor is just continuing to shoot Jim. But Jim wasn't giving up. He was trying to protect his family, and he actually managed to back Victor up all the way to the front door, and he almost had him out of the house, but he finally fell to his hands and knees. He had been shot several times at this point, and he was starting to lose consciousness. Now, at this point, Victor realized that he was out of bullets. So he walked out of the house, he went to his car and reloaded, and then he walked back into Jim and Evelyn's house, and he shot Jim one last time, which did finally kill him. And then he turned his attention to the kids. The kids were aware of what was happening at this point. They were in a total panic. They were screaming and begging Victor not to kill them, but Victor didn't care. First, he shot and killed 11-year-old Dorothy, who was in the living room. She had slept on the fold-out cot the night before. Then, right after he killed Dorothy, he realized that Evelyn had taken baby Larry and crawled out of the bedroom window, and she was running. She was trying to escape. So he just calmly walked out of the house, and he shot and killed Evelyn in the yard. She was still holding the baby when he killed her, and at first, Victor decided to just leave Larry alive in Evelyn's arms, but we'll come back to that. So he walks back into the house and he goes straight to the kids' bedroom and he shot and killed each of the kids in their beds, all except for Phyllis. Phyllis had been lying face down on the bed throughout the entire attack, and she was trying to be as still, as quiet as she could be. Victor would later claim that he decided to let Phyllis live since she never saw his face and she couldn't identify him. I've also read in some sources that he said he let Phyllis live because she had the face of an angel and he just couldn't bring himself to kill her. And some people think that he actually never even noticed Phyllis, like he never knew she was even there because she was just buried underneath her sisters. But whatever the case, Phyllis did manage to make it out alive, but 1-year-old Larry did not survive the attack because Victor decided to go back outside and shoot Larry in the head. Victor later said that he didn't want to shoot Larry, but that he just couldn't stand the thought of him being left there potentially for days without food or water. So he just made the decision to kill him. And the entire time that he was talking about Larry during his confession, he kept referring to him as it. I didn't want to kill it. I didn't want it to suffer. Like, he didn't even think of Larry as a person. After Larry was dead, Victor spent some time walking around the house and the yard picking up shell casings. He was worried that if police found the shell casings, they could identify his rifle as the murder weapon. So he tried his best to pick up every single one. He even went to each of the beds and shook out the blankets to find any shell casings that might be hidden in there. And then he covered the bodies back up. And just keep in mind that Phyllis is still in the room between her 2 dead sisters while he's shaking out the blankets and then covering them back up. I can't believe that a 4-year-old was able to remain so calm in that situation. Like, it's honestly amazing. Then Victor just got back into his car and he calmly drove back home. Later that morning, Will Drew Lang showed up to help Jim like they had planned the day before, and that's when he walked in and discovered Jim's body and he called the police. So during the search of the house, they couldn't really find much evidence. You know, they didn't really find any fingerprints, and the only thing that they could really find were 5 .22 caliber shell casings. Apparently, Victor didn't do such a good job when he was trying to collect them all before he left. They also found a bloody shoe print, but that's pretty much all the evidence that they could really find. So they didn't have too much to go on. And the massacre of the Peterson family completely shook the Shell Lake community. The entire town was in a panic. People were sleeping with guns by their beds. They were locking their doors, which is something that they didn't normally do in the past. People were terrified, and a massive manhunt was conducted. They set up roadblocks to check passing vehicles. They went door to door asking random people questions. They searched people's yards for spent shell casings, pretty much anything they could think to do to find who had done this to the Petersons. A command post was set up at the town hall, and it was basically like a hub for the investigation. People from the community could go there and report anything that they might know about the case. And on August 17th, just 2 days after the murders, they finally got the tip that they had been waiting for. A man from Leask came in and reported that his neighbor had a 21-year-old son who had just recently been released from a psychiatric hospital, and he was super weird and he was super into guns, and they should probably look into him. And his name was Victor Hoffman. So police drove to Leask and they went to the Hoffman home, and Victor's father, Robert, answered the door. And he willingly gave police permission to check Victor's .22 caliber rifle. The rifle was submitted for comparison, and 2 days later, on August 19th, police received word that Victor's gun was a match. So later that same day, right after a funeral service was held for the victims, Victor Hoffman was arrested. And once he was in custody, Victor started talking. He told them everything. He gave them a full confession. And he also said that that night when he was driving around searching for a home to break into, he had originally spotted the Seminar home first, and he had decided to stop there. But he was driving too fast down the road and he ended up accidentally passing up their driveway. So instead, he ended up at the Petersons' home. And throughout the entire interview, he was just so indifferent. He just acted like he couldn't have cared less. Like, he did not care that he had wiped out almost an entire family. He did have a psychiatric evaluation and he was deemed to be competent to stand trial. In the end, Victor Hoffman was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was sent to live out the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital in Ontario. He was interviewed a few times while he was serving his time in the hospital. There was actually a book written about this case, and the author came to the hospital to interview him, and he said he had no remorse for what he had done. And he also said that he still to that day was seeing the devil. The devil visited him every day. Victor Hoffman died of cancer in 2004. And that is all I have on this case. Tell me what you guys think about this one down in the comments. If you guys are interested in this case, I highly recommend listening to the Shell Lake Massacre podcast. It's very well researched, and Kathy Peterson is actually interviewed on the podcast. The host is actually related to Kathy, so there's a lot of firsthand information, tons of details that only someone close to the family would have known. It's very interesting. I highly recommend it, and I will link that down in the description box. If you find this type of content interesting, please consider subscribing to this channel. I have a lot of content planned for this year, so if you find this type of thing interesting, please consider subscribing and turn on notifications so that you'll be notified as soon as I upload a video. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.